Could loving your favorite food actually make you less able to taste it? It sounds absurd. Most of us think the deeper our passion, the sharper our senses. But new research shows us there's a twist. Being a super fan of a sensory experience might actually blind us to the finer details. We're joined today by Maria Rodas, an assistant professor of business administration. She and Jennifer Stoner from the University of North Dakota co-authored a study called Love is Blind, the ironic effect of fans' experience on taste perception. The paper was published in Marketing Letters. So this study is all about how loving something too much can make you less perceptive. It sounds counterintuitive. You'd think the more you love something, the more you'd notice every detail. But at least when it comes to food, that might not be the case.
Yes, no, and that is what was intriguing Jen and myself, because it all started, we were in grad school and we both consider ourselves chocoholics. And so I know that in the paper, the fancy title for this, we say sensory fans, but really the idea started with chocoholics. And so we both consider ourselves chocoholics. And so we came across this very, very expensive and what was touted as the best in the world chocolate. And we're like, of course, we're going to tell the difference. And then what we noticed is that we were eating this very expensive, best in the world chocolate. And we were like, we cannot tell the difference. And we were like, what's going on? Are we unique in this? Because you would believe, and actually that's one of the first things that we tested. We just asked people, do you think that people that are chocoholics would be more discerning? And everyone, like our intuition tells us yes. But then, when we actually conducted these studies in the paper, the 3 studies, we do find that actually, as you were saying, that there is this counterintuitive effect that we are blinded by this love. And so that's why we call the paper Love is Blind. So we see that it happens for the products that you love.
Okay, so let's dive in. The paper focuses on the idea of sensory fans, people who have a deep love for a specific sensory experience with regards to food. Can you tell us a little bit more about that concept?
Yes, it's not necessarily experts because, there is a whole notion, there's people that study, when you're a wine expert, you study and then you are taught how to discern the different notes, etc. These are not experts. These are just people that are really fans. They're like fans of a certain category. And so in our studies, we look at cheese fans and chocoholics, as I mentioned, because that's really how the idea came about. But you can also coffee lovers. And so that's what we mean by sensory fans. It's people that are really, really passionate and have a lot of experience. So they might not have expertise or very formal knowledge, but because you like chocolate so much. And so here I'm also speaking for myself because I like chocolate so much. I've had lots of experience eating and also eating different types of chocolate.
So you went into the lab and did some blind taste tests. You mentioned the foods, cheese, chocolate, and coffee, all foods that people might consider themselves experts in. And you first started with cheese. Tell me a little bit about how you set up and designed this experiment.
Yeah. So, we wanted to identify things that people, it would be easy to find cheese lovers, right? And so a lot of people have this self-proclaimed love for cheese, but also products where we could change different aspects. And so because our main hypothesis going in was, would people be able to detect the differences? And so cheese lends itself really well because cheese varies in terms of sharpness. And so what we did is that we gave participants so it was cheddar and little bags with cubes of cheese. So imagine that was like a fun study to participate in. And so they didn't know which type of cheese they got. And it looked identical, but one was a mild cheddar and the other one was a sharp cheddar. And so we asked people, first of all, how much they like cheese, because we wanted to identify those people that really love cheese. And so from 1 to 10, the ones that were towards the 10, like above the midpoint of the scale. And then we also asked them to rate the sharpness of the cheese. The people that profess more love for cheese were less able to detect that it was indeed a sharper cheese versus milder cheese. And so that's how we first, saw this effect come to life.
So in the blind test, these self-professed cheese fans couldn't notice a difference in the sharpness of the two cheeses. But when you showed them the brand information, they were able to correctly distinguish between sharp and mild cheese. Okay, so then you moved to chocolate, and you found a similar result here?
Absolutely. So, we wanted to, first of all, that's what the original idea came up with chocolate, but we also wanted to make sure that these effects would extend to other categories, that there wasn't just something specific about cheese. And so we did a similar setup but here we specifically recruited people who love chocolate. So at the end of a very long session, we asked participants, would you be willing to do an extra study? And this has nothing to do with the one that you just completed, because usually students do this to get extra credit for their classes. And we said, would you be willing, and in exchange for chocolate? And so as you can imagine, only people who love chocolate would be willing to add another 10 minutes to already like an hour that they spend filling out surveys. And so that's how we recruited chocoholics, because we knew this was a costly behavior. And so only people that love chocolate. And then we did a similar setup as the one with the cheese, but here we changed the strong chocolate versus a milder chocolate using the percentage of cacao that each has. And so one was a little bit darker, the other one was milk chocolate. And then we asked people the similar question. We asked, how dark is this chocolate? That was the question in this. And again, we get very similar result, that those people that like the chocolate even more, they couldn't detect the difference. But we also see, as you were alluding to with the cheese study, that if those participants, some participants got a chocolate bar that had no bran on it, and some participants got one that had a bran in it. And when you have a bran attached to it, all of a sudden that effect goes away. So even the cheese lovers are able to be more discerning when it comes to tasting the cheese, the chocolate.
Just like with the cheese experiment, the participants with the unlabeled chocolate were not able to distinguish between the two bars, but once they had more brand information, they could tell the difference. So the question we're all asking now is, why is this happening? And in the study, you talk about top-down processing versus bottom-up processing. Can you explain what those mean?
When you're thinking bottom-up processing, this is it's also called attribute-based or data-driven. And so it's basically when you're encountered with new information and you're processing each aspect of that information versus top-down. And here it's almost like it's a faster, less cognitive intense way of thinking, because you just apply what you already know, you apply to this new situation. And so for many, as I'm alluding to, the bottom-up processing, the one where you are really processing each of the stimuli that are coming your way, is more taxing. And we as human beings, if we were to process all of the information around us in a bottom-up way, we would be depleted at the end of the day. So that's why, there is this word going around that humans are cognitive misers. Because if there is an opportunity to take a shortcut, a mental shortcut, so that we preserve our cognitive resources, we're going to do it. And so this is what we hypothesize, and then we prove that it's what's going on. So what happens, again, the top-down processing, where you're just doing it the shortcut, the fastest way, the less cognitively taxing way. What people do, if you have more experience, you're going to be applying all of that experience, all of those expectations to the new context. And so chocoholics or cheese lovers or coffee lovers, they have more to draw from. And so they are more able, or they're more likely, and they're also more able to take these shortcuts and so apply these heuristics and process this information very quickly. And so that's why both in the cheese and in the chocolate study, when they are presented with new information, so a brand that they're not familiar with. And so that was the case for the cheese study and the chocolate study. All of a sudden, and this is according to the theory of top-down versus bottom-up processing, new information or novel stimuli, that triggers you to process the information in the more cognitive taxing way, which is the bottom-up. And so that's what's going on.
So instead of taking in every sensory detail from scratch, top-down processing is like our brain taking a shortcut. We use our existing knowledge and expectations to fill in the blanks. I've had chocolate before, so I generally know what it tastes like. Bottom-up processing is when we take in new sensory information in real time without relying on prior knowledge. It's like carefully analyzing each individual flavor note in a cup of coffee. And speaking of coffee, that leads into the third experiment. And in this one, you wanted to encourage bottom-up processing. Tell us about that one.
what we did is that this was at the University of North Dakota, where my co-author is. And so she recruited people that really like coffee. So she had a sign says, do you like coffee? Come do this study to taste coffee. And so we had some participants receive coffee that was lighter roast. And so it was just not as strong. And then other people had like a bolder or darker roast coffee. And so this was one distinction. But then in addition, in order to get more information that it's really that the top-down versus bottom-down processing was at play here, we also had some people giving mindfulness instruction, because mindfulness is this idea that we need to be more present. And actually what it really boils down to is that we should be experiencing more things in a bottom-up way, because it tells you pay attention to all of the details. And there is a very famous exercise where you're supposed to eat a raisin, and you take like 10 minutes eating the raisin because you're supposed to be processing every single bit of like eating one raisin. So we basically took inspiration from that and gave instructions on how to, in a very mindful way, drink the coffee. And so it was like, pay attention to the temperature and the different notes in your mouth. And so we just adapted mindfulness instructions. And what we found is that once we do that, even the people that love coffee, self-professed coffee lovers, then all of a sudden they were able to accurately detect whether the coffee was strong or whether it was weak. And so that gave us support for this idea that, yes, that's what's going on. Like without any novelty cues or without being told to process things in a more mindful way, people do go into this shortcut heuristic way that you were describing. But now, if instructed, you can basically correct this bias that we have.
Just by being more mindful, they were able to actually taste the coffee better. Does this suggest that we have more control over our sensory experiences than we might think?
Oh, absolutely. And that's really the basis of the mindfulness movement and the mindfulness research, is that really, like it's all about perceptions, and how we process the information around us dictates, like how much we're going to like things, like our attitudes towards it. So we absolutely have control over how we're going to experience things around us. You're absolutely right.
Okay, let's zoom back out for a minute. What does this all mean? What are the implications for consumers and for companies out there? If I'm a big company, should I not try to create any new versions of my products because my most loyal customers won't be able to tell the difference anyway? What do you think?
Well, in theory, yes. But I think for me and before academia, I spent many, many years working at General Mills. And for me, it's a little bit more has to do with formulations and reformulations of products, where I think this research could have very big implications, because what companies like General Mills, like a lot of consumer packaged goods companies, they go back to their products and they change it, and so it's what you're saying, but maybe in different way. For example, I was working at General Mills on Yoplait, and they wanted to reduce how sweet the product was, but they didn't want to alienate the consumers. So what they did, what many companies do, is that they do these blind tests. And they specifically do them blind. And so here, it's kind of counterintuitive, because they might be doing a blind test might lead to a misguided decision, because they might think, oh, no one is noticing. But what about once people are aware of the brand, or if they say new reformulation, if there is any novelty cue, all of a sudden people will realize. And so even though the company had the intention, it's like, we want to change it just under the threshold where people won't notice, inadvertently they might be doing something different.
If you could go back in time and redo some of those taste tests, how might you design them in a more ideal way, knowing what you know now?
I think for me, my favorite way would be to do the mindfulness prompt, and so you have consumers come in, and because there are some advantages in doing it blind, you don't want people to be too biased by prior expectations that they have about the brand, not about the product. And so I would still keep doing them blind, but do borrow from these mindfulness cues and ask participants when they come in and then they do this test, for the companies, to really pay attention to all aspects of the experience of eating, whatever product it is. And so in a way, prompt them to think in a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach.
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't have to be passive consumers of sensory information. We can actually shape our own experiences, even with our favorite foods. By being more mindful, more present, we can open ourselves up to a whole new world of enjoyment. That was Assistant Professor of Business Administration Maria Rodas. The study is called Love is Blind, the ironic effect of fans' experience on taste perception. You can read more about this and other research from Gies College of Business at giesbusiness.illinois.edu.